Welcome to the Tech Beyond Gender podcast, where we dive into stories of remarkable women who are breaking barriers in the tech industry. Today, we are thrilled to have Dr. Michelle Dickinson with us, a nanotechnologist and materials engineer with over 2 decades of experience. Dr. Dickinson has dedicated her career in advancing technology and medical solutions from startups to large-scale R&D projects. She co-founded Nanogirl Labs, a socially conscious business aimed at making STEM accessible to everyone through diverse role models, engaging storylines, and hands-on learning. Stay tuned as we discuss her journey and explore her vision for a more inclusive industry. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Michelle. Nice to have you here.
Thanks, Mina. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Michelle, your journey from a background of limited educational opportunities to becoming a leader in science and technology, and also an advocate for diversity, is truly inspiring. Can you take us back to your early days and share about your upbringing and what really influenced your drive to break barriers and pursue a career in STEM?
Yeah, I think I'll start with you only know what you know when you're a child. And so, my parents were young, they had limited education, and they worked minimum wage jobs like so many of our population who are working multiple jobs to try and make ends meet. I think, you don't always realize how big an impact formal good education can have on your long-term income and your long-term sort of career prospects. And my parents, sadly, without that sort of great education, didn't have that, and then had a child and worked really hard. And I grew up in a household where my parents, really, I remember where we didn't have enough food on the table and my parents chose to feed me and would, say, oh, mummy and daddy aren't hungry today. It's a staunch memory I have of not having enough food in the house because we couldn't make the bills. I remember walking around the supermarket and my mum had a list of exactly how much cash we had. And we had to often put things back at the end when the trolley was full because we just, we had to make decisions about what foods we couldn't have this week. And I think growing up around that and then seeing other people in the supermarket just putting anything in, I was like, okay, not everybody is having to do this calculation. Not everybody is missing out on certain foods. How do I get to be like them? But I knew what I knew, and not growing up in an academic household, I didn't really understand the value of education, I think, as much as I should have, or I could have. And I lived in areas that were, let's call them rough. And so the kids I was hanging out with and their parents also were not aspiring to be anything other than minimum wage workers. And it's a big reason why I do what I do now, because I think you can only be what you can see. If you don't know, there are other careers out there other than minimum. My mum worked in bars, and I thought, well, maybe I'll work in bars too. And I worked in bars for a long time in hospo, working minimum wage. So I've been very fortunate that a whole bunch of stuff has happened in my life that meant that I did actually get formal education in the end, and quite a few degrees. I started collecting them. But my drive comes from understanding that not everybody knows these careers exist. Not everybody knows how they could really help you with an income, or I always say education can help to break the poverty cycle. And so I'm a big advocate for how do we get more diverse people into the tech space. And diversity for me is not just gender, it's also socioeconomic. And how do we get families who are growing up perhaps in areas that don't have access to tech or careers in tech realize that there's a whole world out there for them.
So, where did you grow up, Dr. Michelle?
So my father ended up joining the military when he was 16, because what you do when you don't have any qualifications is you can join the military and they'll pay you straight away. And so we ended up living in a lot of different places. We moved a lot. So I spent a lot of time growing up in Hong Kong until I was 11, and then we moved to the UK when I was 11, and I did my high school there. But we were moving around a lot, even if we were in the same country, we were moving from base to base. So, I was moving schools quite a bit. And I think that also sometimes can have an effect on your education when you're not consistent in a school. But yeah, I grew up as a person of the world, moving around a lot, traveling a lot. And then I would say my formative years were probably in the United Kingdom.
Cool. So, what was your education like? What did you pursue for your undergrad?
Yeah, so I was not very academic at school. If I look back now, I was probably really smart, just not academically smart. I'm I'm not good at reading or writing. I never have been, but I'm really good at building. But there were no subjects in school other than woodwork, which I thrived at, that really accelerated, your hands-on skills. And nobody said, Michelle, you are amazing. I did woodwork and metalwork at school, and honestly, it was my best subjects. But nobody said you could do that as a career or you should. And I think that's part of the stereotype for me, a girl who was good at woodwork and metalwork, but nobody said, could you pursue this as a career? Um, and so I ended up leaving school with very poor grades, and not really knowing what I wanted to do. And not seeing the point in school. I would do something in maths and I'd be like, when am I ever going to use this? And so I just wasn't interested in it. Same in science. So you'd have to memorize the periodic table. I'm like, I don't care about all of these elements that I literally am never going to come across in life. So I was quite a troubled student, smart, but not seeing the point, so therefore easily distracted. And I didn't get the grades to get into university for sure. And so I left school and I started working minimum wage jobs. I worked in a sports store in the day, and I worked in a bar and a Chinese restaurant at night. And I just worked, 70, 80 hours a week at minimum wage, going, if I work extra hours, that's how I'm going to save. That's how I'm going to get somewhere in life. Now, there is a program in the UK, which is very unique, and I wish more countries did it. And it's a program called Clearing. And Clearing is a program where if there are any spaces left at university, they sort of give them out to the kids who don't have the grades to get in. So, because they want to fill their places. Um, and ended up through a whole bunch of opportunities and, my sports store manager pushing me and other people seeing the smartness in me that I never saw in myself. Because I think we define ourselves by our grades. And because I had low grades, I had obviously labeled myself as not very smart. But people saw my practical smarts and were like, actually, Michelle, you're really clever. You're just clever in a way that school never measured. You should think about doing something else. So I met a whole bunch of people while I was working, and one of them was an engineer. And he said, oh, Michelle, you're definitely an engineer. Have you thought about studying engineering? And it was the first time I'd ever heard that word used with me. It was the first time somebody had opened up a career opportunity that actually really fit what I was good at. And so, yeah, I ended up getting in through a clearing system on a probation to the University of Manchester, and I thrived. That was it. I was definitely born to be an engineer. I was definitely supposed to be there. I went at the time, it was a place called UMIST, which they merged to the University of Manchester, which are polytechnic university. So it was a lot of practical, hands-on aspects. And nobody at school had told me that there are different types of tertiary study, that you can do things where you're building and using your hands. And I wish, my woodwork teacher had said, you're really good at building, maybe you should follow this pathway. But I never had that advice. Um, so I ended up getting my degree in biomedical materials engineering. I did a degree and a master's in that, and then ended up moving to the US to do a materials engineering specializing in nanotechnology PhD in New Jersey.
Wow, what is nanotechnology?
Nano is just tiny. So if you think of a size scale, you have a meter, a centimeter, you keep going down, you'll get to a nanometer. The best way to describe it is if you look at the width of your hair is about 100,000 nanometers wide. So it's smaller than your eye can see. And it's a technology, we define it as a technology where one dimension is 100 nanometers or less. And we're using it to build tiny things that go into your smart devices, that go into medical products. Like your body is a nano machine, basically. If you think of your cells and viruses and DNA, most of the things in our human body are at that nanoscale. And so we try and build things at a similar scale to help our bodies to repair themselves, to fix disease. And if you think about your smart devices, your smartphone or your laptop, I mean, they're much smaller and smarter than they were even 5 years ago. And that's because we're making the technology smaller to go inside them so we can put more things in there so that your new, whatever phone it is, has a 3 times better camera and more memory. So it's just basically engineering really tiny things for mostly medical, for me, medical and electronics.
Cool. So now looking at tiny things and doing a PhD on it, right? Has your work on nanoscale influenced your perspective on the idea that at a fundamental level that we all are one? Do you see any parallels between the interconnectedness in nanotechnology and the need for unity and inclusivity in industry?
I think as I work a lot in the medical sector, I'm always amazed at how complicated our body is and how each of the tiny components in our body need the other components to create what is an amazing, let's say, a human being or any mammal or any animal. If you think about how many different parts work every single day to make us work, everything is interconnected. And I work a lot in science communication, and so I get to, talk to some really interesting people. And I remember I was interviewing an astronaut who said, I don't know what's wrong with humans. We all are fighting against each other, but you only need to sit on a space station and look at the one planet, and we only have the one place. Like, it's crazy. And so sometimes I think, that either really tiny perspective that I have or the really far away perspective you get from those who are in space, we just look at humans and go, why are we fighting over tiny things? Why are we not working together? And humans have only survived because we work together with our different skills to actually survive as a species. We'd never make it if we had to do everything by ourselves.
Yeah. So what you described about nanotechnology just reminded me of the meditations as well, right? The science behind meditation also sort of originates from the idea that you just keep dissecting and going to the tiniest particle and then just keep dissecting it further and further. Then you just come to realize that there is just nothing but space. And then it's just nothing but oneness, right? So yeah, that's what inspired me to ask a question. How you always used to wonder, like, if only we could meditate and be in that state, we just sort of feel the unity, right? So in that unity, obviously, there is no gender, there is no race, there's nothing. Like we are all just one.
And if you break us down, we're all just atoms with lots of space between us. I think sometimes humans have this arrogance of, oh, well, we're humans and we are better than other species. Or like, if you look at it, we can't survive without everything else that's on our planet, that's in our solar system. And we're just made up of the same atoms as everything else. So, yeah, I think removing our own arrogance around our how important we are as a species and actually just going back to atoms, and atoms are just tiny things with so much space within them.
Mm.
I think we take that for granted sometimes.
Yeah. So have you faced any gender biases in your career?
Oh, yeah, a list of them. But, I think I've always said that those are sometimes the thing, if they don't break you, they grow your resilience and they're what make you much stronger. And actually, I credit a lot of my success through my career due to some of the things I faced, especially as a young professional. It's I, working in engineering, I was usually the only female in a room. I was a young female. I'd not come from an Ivy League school. So there were many things that differentiated me that people didn't add as much respect to, perhaps. And so I felt like I had to fight much harder. I remember many times that, as I sat in a room, people would looking at me going, are you going to take the minutes? And I'm like, I'm not your minute lady. Like I'm part of this meeting. Like I'm the engineer. And the surprise on their faces that, I wasn't there as a secretary to take the minutes, and coming across that multiple times. Um, or having to really fight for my voice to be heard in technical meetings because people just assumed that I didn't have the experience or the knowledge. I think that resilience helps you to, number one, carve your story into what works well and how to help convince people against their own stereotypes. I mean, everybody has a bias. We all have that based on our own upbringing. So it's not that people deliberately dismiss you. It's just something that, they're not used to as we're changing this landscape. Um, and so often, I think my experiences were downplayed because people were like, well, what would she know? And often because I was a diverse person in the room, my solutions were very different to what was being offered. I hadn't followed the same Ivy League degree. I hadn't come from the same background, and I saw problems quite differently. And so, what people dismissed as, well, 9 people in the room think this, and Michelle thinks that, actually eventually were celebrated as oh, we hadn't thought of that angle before. Actually, that solves a different problem we hadn't seen. So I think understanding that diversity is really important allowed me to have a stronger voice and help people to see that my different opinion was actually a good thing, not a bad thing. But at the time, it was awful. As a young professional, I just felt so alone and I didn't see the point. And that's why I do a lot of work now mentoring young technical females and they're still facing this, to go, hey, it's part of a process and we're trying to change the process. But honestly, it will help you to communicate better, and people will start to shift with you as the tide shifts around adding diversity to the STEM and tech sector.
So, how did you start your career after a PhD?
Yeah, I was actually headhunted during my PhD. So I was doing some things during my PhD that impressed a company who was working in nanotechnology, and they were building nanotechnology testing machines, and they ended up headhunting me a year before I even graduated and offering me a job. So I went straight to work for them. They were a nanotech consultancy company in the States. And that was an amazing career for me because I was brought in as a consultant to go to help, I mean, universities all over the world, professors all over the world solve their nanotech problems. Some of the largest tech companies in the world brought me in to help solve some of their nanotech problems. So it was the best job I could ever have had because I got to see inside huge companies like, Apple and IBM and every university that had any sort of materials or nanotech research, and got to work alongside some of the top professors. So it was amazing for me to see both how startups work and how big tech works, how innovation works, who's driving that, what happens there. I feel really fortunate to have, number one, been headhunted, and number two, have found my thing, right? And I'm a problem solver, and I was actually really good at the job that I did, and helped that company to grow from a standard nanotech testing company to one that was able at the end to be able to test all sorts of medical devices and biological tissues, and really developed new techniques to do things in biology that hadn't been thought about before.
So then, how did you land up in New Zealand from
Mm.
America?
America's an interesting place to live. I'm not from there. And, anybody who's following politics right now will know that it's quite polar. And I think, as I was living there and I lived all around and I was traveling a lot, it was great. But I was traveling 80% of the time, and I was starting to come up against, a culture perhaps that was at odds with some of my values. And I said, well, I've been doing this job for, a long time. I'm at that point in my life where I'm ready for another chapter. And as a kid that grew up moving around the world,
Mm.
also maybe that next chapter is, maybe it's time to try a new country. And so I sort of tried a few countries on. I sort of went traveling and had a look around, thought about what I love in life. I love nature. I love, a more liberal type of personality. If you think about politics, I love safety and freedom. I love the ocean. Um, and what I am a kite surfer, and so I needed somewhere that was windy, that had the ocean close by. And I just took a map of the world and started looking at places, and yeah, landed in Australia first, and realized that most things outdoors in Australia try to kill you, so it quickly went off my list. And then I realized New Zealand was right next door, and came and had a look, and started down in Dunedin. Realized it was too cold for me there, and worked my way up and eventually found myself in Auckland. And it's an amazing place. And for me, I'm mixed race. So my mum is Hong Kong Chinese, my father is half British and half Maltese. And so I was looking for somewhere that had really good diversity around different ethnicities. That was important to me. And Auckland has that in spades. So I ended up here.
Awesome. So, when you were working soon after your graduation in America, so did you actually come across being treated different for your race or gender?
Not for my race, definitely for my gender. I mean, it was rare in the world that I was in that there were any other women in the room, especially technical women. And so um, I definitely had to sort of fight my corner. The assumption always was that I wasn't there as the technical person. I was there to make tea. And so having to overcome that barrier. Um, I think also I try to blend in a lot at the beginning of my career. When you're early, all you want to do is not stand out and blend in and just hope that everybody likes you. Um, and I've learned that that's probably not the best solution because I am different for a reason. I think having a different background, whether that's gender or ethnicity or whatever it is important. Your background helps you to see the world in your own way that can help solve problems in a different way than those who didn't have your background. And so trying to blend in doesn't solve problems better. It actually solves them in a worse way because you're not getting a diverse range of opinions. So at the beginning, I found it really hard, really isolating. I felt like I was having to defend myself a lot against and sexist comments, right? You see it all the time, especially because I was on the road a lot of advances by males, not the type that you would like, on work trips and the culture of traveling as a scientist is you're going to the hotel at night, everybody's using their company card to buy a few more beers, and like it's not a nice place to be traveling on the road. Um, so having to, think about my safety a lot. And there's been a few instances, and I haven't really talked about them, where, my safety was compromised. Um, and that I think that's when we look at the Me Too movement, I think there's a lot of hidden stories that we don't talk about that actually have come from women who have been in positions where, they're around more powerful men and it's been intimidating for them. So yeah, I definitely struggled and I look back at myself in my 20s and go, "Oh man, I wish Michelle you had somebody to just stick up for you and help you." I look at a lot of things I went through and it's what I try and do now for young women. Because it was lonely and I didn't have a strong mentor who saw the help that I probably needed at the time. And nobody was helping me to navigate what it's like to be a young woman on the road at all of these tech companies trying to sort of navigate their confidence. And, I probably had I definitely had imposter syndrome. So also I wasn't believing myself a lot when people told me that, oh, what do you know, Michelle? So yeah, I'm surprised I survived it actually, and here I am, and here I am. And what's interesting is throughout the time, I remember all of the things I was coming across that I found really hard. I used to say to myself, "Oh, somebody needs to do something about this," and I just got to a grumpy old age where I said, "Actually, I am somebody," and there was a turning of the tide there for me where I said, "I can keep complaining about this, or I can roll up my sleeves and see what I can do to help change this systemically, so that other young people don't have to go through the same things that I did."
That's amazing. But I would really like to go back to something that you've commented on a couple of times already, where it by default, when you are in a meeting room, men tend to think that you are the secretary, you are there to take minutes, or you are there to serve them coffee or tea. So what happened? Like, how did you actually break that barrier? Because I've heard different stories in the past where someone said, just make the worst coffee ever, and they're not going to ask you again for it.
Do you know what? For the first few years, I did it. I made the tea, I made the coffee, and I took the minutes
Oh, wow. After
because,
doing a PhD in engineering
yeah,
nanotechnology, and you
because
were a, yeah, yeah.
because these were I mean, it was mostly Caucasian males in their 40s and 50s, and if I wanted to be in that room, I just went, well, this is the expectation. I want to progress my career. I still want to be in this room. So I'll just
Wow.
do the things. I definitely did it for years until one day I just got annoyed and I was like, no, I'm not here to make your tea. But I think as women, we just do it. We're people pleasers, a lot of us. And so when people said, oh, Michelle, go make the tea and take the minutes, I'm like, okay. And then I realized all
Which
this
year
extra
was it?
workload. Oh, this was back in the mid 2000s, early to mid 2000s.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I just did it for a while. I'm in my early 20s and men are telling me to do this and I just did it. I kick myself now for being that person. But yeah, it took me
Mm.
a long time to build the confidence to go, actually, no, you can make your own tea. Or the other thing that they would do is they would leave their dirty coffee cups in the meeting room and not do anything with them. And I would go, well, somebody's got to clean this up. So I would stay late and just, wash all the coffee cups at the end of the meeting. I just saw it as stuff that needed to be done. And then I realized later on, what am I doing? Why am I cleaning these guys' coffee cups? Like, because all it does is just keep the expectation going that
Yeah.
it's women's work and this is what you do, no matter what your qualifications. So it took me multiple years to build up the confidence to say, actually, make your own tea. And who have you scheduled to take the minutes? Because it's not my job. But at the beginning, I definitely did it because I didn't have the confidence to say no.
Wow. So, like being treated that way can also have an impact on your imposter syndrome, right?
I have the worst imposter syndrome. I still have imposter syndrome. I don't think anybody doesn't have it. I started to do some research of my own into imposter syndrome, and it was really interesting. So I moved to New Zealand and I became an academic at the University of Auckland. And I was hired on the same day as another man who was a similar age to me, and we came in at the same level. And while I was at the university, I watched him get promoted 5 times before I got promoted once. And I was like, look at him. He's getting all these jobs and jobs that he doesn't even seem to have any expertise in. And I found it amazing. And so after 5 years, I'm watching his career accelerate and obviously his income accelerate. I said, can we go out for coffee? Do you remember me? We met on day one. He's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I took him out for coffee and I was just trying to pick his brains on like how he had the confidence to apply for all of these things. And I said, that voice inside your head? And he looked me dead straight in the eye and he said, the one that says I'm awesome. I stopped. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, the voice inside my head that tells me I'm awesome every day. And I realized that his internal monologue and my internal voice were very, very different. My internal voice is always telling me, don't apply for it till you've got all of the qualifications and extras just in case. Don't put yourself forward unless you're really sure you'll get it. And he was putting himself forward for things that he had almost zero experience in. But because he thought he was awesome, his internal monologue said, well, if I don't get it, whatever. Whereas I think if I didn't get something I'd applied for, I'd have been really disappointed in myself.
Hmm.
And it's something we see along the gender research around how if something goes wrong, typically for boys, and I do a lot of research into girls and boys and their fear of failure, boys typically blame the thing for it going wrong, whereas girls typically will blame themselves or an internal trait that meant it didn't go wrong. And this happens very young, from the age of about 7 or 8. And I think it just keeps going as we get older. But that meeting for me started me interviewing a whole bunch of other successful males that I had seen do things that I thought you have no skills in this and you're doing this about their inner voice. And all of their inner voices were the I am awesome voice. And yeah, I think part of imposter syndrome is our voices, our internal voices are always telling us that we're not awesome, we can't do things. And so for me, navigating imposter syndrome is taking stop and looking at that voice and going, I hear you, but I'm just going to maybe ignore you for a little bit because I know that some of my counterparts are going for this because their voice says they're great. So what if I change my perspective and pretended my voice said I was great? Would that change how I approached a problem or applied for something? And it totally did. And so I think my inner voice will still tell me that I'm terrible and I'm not worthy of certain things. But I have a way now of challenging that voice and going, well, what's the worst that happens if I try it? And I think that fear of failure is what we always, is the reason why we don't do things. But actually, what's the worst happens if you fail? You don't get it. Okay. People go, oh, she applied for it, she didn't get it. Okay. Like it's actually a fear of things that really have little consequence often.
It's just a shift in mindset, right? It just seems very easy and simple, like a shift in the mind voice.
And I don't know why my mind voice was so different to this guy's mind voice. But it was, and it's so funny because I then came home to my husband who was looking in the mirror in the bathroom and he was just staring at himself. And I realized even my husband every day looks in the mirror and is telling himself he's awesome. And I'm looking in the mirror and I'm looking for my gray hairs and my wrinkles and I'm always looking for the negatives and he's just thinking he's great. And so it's
Yeah.
around us all the time, and I hadn't seen it. And it is a mindset shift. And I don't know where that stems from, but my mindset had never been one of confidence. It had always been one of, if I work hard enough and I get the top things, then maybe I'll apply for a low level role. Whereas I've actually met a lot of people who don't seem to have imposter syndrome who do the opposite.
Yeah, it just makes me think about me growing up in India. It's like a male child being born in the family is just considered to be very good. But the families get happy. Oh my gosh, we have a boy now to carry on the family tradition, the family name and stuff. I think maybe just hearing that or being in an environment like that where more importance is just given to men, like just being a man is enough, right? Just being a
Yeah.
male is enough. But for women, just being born as a woman is not enough. You need
It's so
to,
interesting
yeah.
because I think that cultural thing is important, right? You don't think about it, but my mum being Chinese, she was very adamant that I wanted to do ballet. I remember I wanted to do ballet as a kid. And my mum said, you can't do ballet because your thighs will get too thick and a husband will never pick you.
Oh my
And she
God.
also said, don't go outside. I wanted to go outside and play with my brother. And she said, don't go outside because you'll get tan skin and nobody will want to marry you. You have to stay pale and white. And it was all about my physical appearance for my success. And it's a very cultural thing. And I ended up being a kid who loved being outside and was very tanned, which my mom thought was super ugly. And also being very sporty and muscular, which again was never going to find me the husband. But those are cultural aspects I think as females we have pressure on us about that I started to derive my thoughts of success around my physical appearance more than my academic success. And I think lots of those cultural things also add into that imposter syndrome because I obviously hadn't met my mum's expectations of what was successful to find the perfect husband. Um, and that also, I think all of those things tie in. And I think when we talk about culture, it's important to think about some of the pressures that different genders have on them that we don't even think about that other genders or other cultures might not have.
I think that across different cultures, there will be some element of bias, but it could be very subtle. Someone was having a conversation with a few weeks back. She's from Australia, an Australian woman who actually came across a research paper about the gender stereotypes. And she was saying how, right from a younger age, like especially our generations or older, they were encouraged to get into sewing or artwork or dancing or singing or performance arts, where they had to really perfect their art before coming out and performing in public, or like even showing an artwork. You really sort of feel that you need to nail it. You need to be 100% correct. You need to be extremely skilled before showing it. But whereas with boys, they are so trained to playing like team sports out in the field. They could be really bad at it, but they just still run around, fall, stand up again, and then they repeat the same thing again and they get cheered for it. So that on its own sort of has a huge impact besides anything else, right?
Totally. And the research, and I do a lot of research in this space now for Nanogirl Labs because I'm thinking constantly about how our childhood shapes some of these
Mm.
cultural things that might define whether or not we're confident to go into a STEM career in the long term. And we see that all the time. Often little girls are told if you're given a coloring pencil and something to color in, you're called, be careful, color in between the lines, make sure, you don't go over the lines, do it
Mm.
perfect, do it pretty. And you'll see a male child who just scribbles everywhere. And the excuse is, oh, he's just messy. Like it's almost dismissed as a trait of being male versus and we don't realize we do some of this unconscious things around our children, but it can have a long-term effect on their confidence for failure later on or their need for everything to be in its place and perfect and pretty and yeah, so and it just is part of society. We do have these unconscious biases around children. It's so interesting because I have twins,
Mm.
and one is male and one is female. And even externally watching how people interact with them, it's so different. And there's nothing, they're the same age, they do like the same things, but we just have these biases where they're definitely treated differently because of their perceived gender. And so that's just part of the culture we grow up in. And so, my work is, well, how do we know what some of those biases are and help our young people to navigate that? You can also work on the other side of that. And here's what it might look like because you might not have experienced it.
Mm. So, in your early days, when you had all these different challenges with biases, gender biases, how did you navigate through them? What were your strategies to handle those biases?
I think I did what every young person who was overwhelmed did. I went home and cried a lot for a while and then realized that wasn't going to fix me. And so then I started seeking out help. How do I find mentors? How do I find other people? How do I find other female engineers? And look, this is a time before Facebook. Like, this is not a place where you had, if you were lucky, there was an online forum that, was awful to navigate. Um, but as I was traveling a lot, every so often I would meet maybe another young female academic, and I just chat to them about it. And not just females, other males, and just going out for a beer or a chat, or just being able to sometimes talk about what I was experiencing and then hearing that it wasn't okay and it wasn't normal was really helpful for me. And once I heard that, and also, you started to see that it wasn't just me. Every time I met another female engineer in the field, she was often going through a very similar thing. How did we become allies to each other? We knew we couldn't change the whole system, but how were we at least just making sure we checked in once a month on a phone call to make sure everybody was okay? And if anybody had a strategy that had worked, how do we share it with everybody else? Um, and so, yeah, creating a group, I call it a tribe of like-minded people or people who are facing similar things to sort of try and solve it as a group versus trying to solve it on your own. And that also reduced the loneliness when I heard that other women were also finding the same thing. I was like, okay, it's not just me. Because sometimes you take it so personally. You go, oh,
Mm.
people just dismiss me because maybe I'm not good enough. But then you realize there's a bit of a trend. Um, and this was, we really weren't talking about this stuff back then. We didn't have I think of the Susan Sarandon book, and how that's totally changed. And she came out with a book that basically said, you've got to have a place at the table. But that was before that time. So we weren't talking about these movements of how do we push women forward in the tech space. Um, yeah, so I started just crying on my own, and that didn't solve anything. So I reached out and sort of created a tribe around how do we hear each other and how do we offer solutions if we have them.
Yeah. It's interesting that I still feel that it's better than before. Obviously, we are starting to have these conversations, but at the same time, I do feel there's a lot of self-silencing, and we still are touching more at the surface level. We are not really comfortable to talk more into the real issues. And again, being in a small country like New Zealand, not many women are even comfortable to come up and speak out about those issues. Has this been your observation as well?
Yeah, it's a small country and you don't want to stick your head out here because you don't want to be
Yeah.
known. And I've done it a few times and it's been tried, people have tried to cut it off. There's been a few times. There was an instance where there was a very sexist metalworks company that I approached because I had some real issues around safety. I was teaching at the time and I was worried that my female graduates going to work there would not be safe. And I approached him, and anyway, the newspaper picked it up and it turned into this big story. And I got so much abuse from mostly male engineers going, see, this is why women shouldn't be in there because you're just trying to disrupt, just the old school, old boys club mentality going against it. We've seen it so recently. It's awful. Sadly, with our Navy boat sinking that had a female captain, and the awful comments I have seen around her gender, meaning that she shouldn't have been in charge of a boat. We're definitely not living in times that I think that are much better. I think we're talking about it more, but I think the blatant sexism that we are still seeing is awful, and I think it's hard to stand up and fight against it without worrying that if you're in a career that it might, affect your career because it's a small country. So yeah, I think especially in New Zealand, we might have to be more subtle about how we approach some of these issues and maybe not making them so public and trying to have quiet conversations behind the scenes because, that's what we are as a nation. And I think in every different country, you have a different way of solving these problems. And I think in New Zealand, it isn't by sticking your head out necessarily, and calling people out because I just don't think we have that culture here that works well.
Mm. Yeah. So now, um, have you noticed more diversity in tech since you started your career back in US?
Yes. Look, yes and no. Here's what I've noticed. There's definitely more diversity in students who are studying tech subjects, for sure. I
Hmm.
think about, even when I joined the University of Auckland, I think our intake was 11% female students. And when I left a decade later, it was up to 26.5%. So huge number of female students starting to come in. What we're seeing now in the research is that we're losing them later on. So often we're losing them within the first 5 years of them entering the profession. So although they're getting into it, they're not staying in it. And so I think all we've done, we call it a leaky pipeline where we're leaking all of these people. We've just shifted where the leak in the pipe is from them not starting to study tech subjects to actually them leaving very early on in their career. And that time often coincides with a change in family lifestyle. You might want to have a family and it's not flexible. A recent study out of the University of Auckland showed that there was feelings of isolation and loneliness, the stuff that we've been through, just that being the only female on a team, not being respected. Even in New Zealand, I've because I do a lot of this work with women. There's women who are out on construction sites going, there's no porta potties for us. We're expected to pee behind a bush, and I can't do that if I'm on my period. Like, there's just basic
Mm.
hygiene things that haven't been catered for because it's always been a sort of, oh yeah, the guys will just wee around the corner and nobody cares. We've not catered for that. I was recently at a company not that long ago, 3 years ago, and we were outside looking at some of their things. And I said, oh, I need to go to the bathroom. Is there a bathroom? And he pointed me to a toilet block, an outside toilet block. And I was like, great. And it was a gents toilet block. And they
Oh.
said, oh, it's only for men. I said, is there a women's one? And he'd worked there for 20 years. And he's like, oh, no, that's the only toilet block around here. The other one will be inside where the receptionists work, which was a good, I don't know, 10-minute walk away. And even today, I'm finding places that don't have,
Mm.
easy to access bathrooms for all genders. And I go, but he'd never seen that because he's only ever used the bathroom that he's used. You don't always see the problems when you're not facing them. Um, and so, my role is always to just pipe up about something if I see it and go, well, could you make this a unisex toilet out here? Like, why does it have to have gents on the door? And just little things that might help to make people feel more welcome. So I think we are increasing the number of tech early career people in the STEM fields. I'm not seeing it in the leadership and the higher senior levels increase.
Hmm. I'm also like, I feel like even in senior technical roles, you don't see very many women. They do come in, but somehow they tend to get distracted to a platform manager, delivery manager, people manager sort of roles, right? And for some reason, we don't really see many leaders within the organizations either. So they're sort of stuck somewhere in the middle management sort of area, feels like it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And part of that is, well, so I talk to a lot of my ex-graduates, female engineers who are fully qualified engineers, and a lot of them have moved into banking, for example, and
Hmm.
they go work for a bank. And I said, well, why? You could work for this amazing engineering company. And they said, it's really easy. I've got flexibility. I can job share. I'm working with a whole bunch of other women. My skills are the same. I'm mathematical. I'm problem solving. Why wouldn't I work in a place that has diversity at its core where I don't have to fight for it versus one where I'm always feeling like, and I totally get that. So I feel like it's a waste of their degree, which is terrible. But I understand why they're leaving and why they're not making it to the senior levels. Um, and I do think it's something that we do need to change because, as we know, increasing diversity helps long term all businesses to increase the types of problems they solve and the types of people they recruit. Um, and so, yeah, I still think it's a challenge.
Yeah. So, what steps do you believe are necessary to address and dismantle gender stereotypes that persist in STEM education and professional environments?
Oh, big question. I think there's so many things. So let's start at the beginning. I work a lot with schools. I think even our teachers are biased and they don't realize it. A lot of them don't know about many of the STEM jobs that exist out there. They've been in teaching their whole life, and that's great. They're not expected to know. So part of my work is advocating for some of the different STEM roles that they might not have thought about, that they might want to guide their students into, that they didn't think about before, and also providing practical hands-on experiments and examples of things they can be doing in the classroom to build their children's confidence around STEM. So how do we teach you robotics as a teacher so that you can then get all of your students to play in robotics? And now if you're confident in robotics at school, you might consider a robotics career. Some of those things fundamentally at a younger level. I do a lot of early career mentoring around helping young women who are in the STEM fields to, number one, connect with a different tribe. So, how do I connect you with people who are similar to you so you can sort of have your monthly event, the thing that I used to do? And then how do we solve those problems? But also working with organizations around mentorship. And the thing I found really powerful is when you provide a mentor that is a young female in an engineering company with a very senior male, and they have to mentor each other
Mhm.
once a month. And it's been interesting because the senior males have come to me and gone, this has been the most eye-opening experience I've ever had, because the things that these young women are coming in and worrying about are things that I didn't even know existed in our organization, that I'd never considered, and they're things that I can easily fix. And so that unconscious bias is easier to break if you're hearing about the problems. And often a young female coming into a very senior male will talk about problems that he would never have experienced or seen, and so has never thought about how do you solve them. And so I work hard on trying to connect that mismatch of a mentorship. And actually, often the senior males have said, "Thank you. I've been mentored more in this than I think I have mentored the young woman," and hopefully create systemic change within the organization. Because often it's those senior people who can really change the fundamentals around workplace and culture. And if they don't see the things that need changing, they never get changed. Um, and then I think changing the landscape, I often say to people, name me a female scientist or engineer who leads their own, science or engineering TV show. Like, what are we doing around our media? What are we doing around positive role models that help to change the narrative that we see so that we as parents, we as teachers, we as humans will also realize that these workplaces can be diverse, these roles can be diverse. And a lot of those stereotypes come from our media. And so how are we also pushing to our media companies going, making sure that you are showcasing good diversity when you're talking about science and tech. Um, and I think we still have a long way to go with that as well. So I think it's multifaceted. I think there are lots of little things that can be tweaked that help the whole system to move forwards to a more diverse and a more inclusive STEM place.
What you just mentioned was quite interesting about senior male mentoring a young woman, right? But I was reading another research recently where they were talking about women can actually, they don't really see themselves, people like themselves in senior roles, which becomes very difficult for them to aspire to get into those roles as well. And then they think, okay, maybe people like myself can probably take another career path, not necessarily this path, is what I've heard. Have you come across anything similar to that?
I've come across something worse than that, and it's a problem I think that we really need to check ourselves on. I've seen more times than I would like to admit, senior females who are actually quite harsh on young women. They're almost I call it pulling the ladder up because it's been so hard for them to get to where they are. They feel like these young women need to do it hard too to realize, how much work it takes to get there. And I find that attitude so awful, but I have come across it a lot. Um, and so I really highlight those amazing female role models who are in the spaces who are open to mentoring and are open to being positive role models. But I don't think all senior female leaders are positive role models. And I think we have to be really careful with that. And sometimes it's why I choose a male mentor instead of a female mentor, because they're not always as kind as I think they can be. And I think it's this, I don't know, I had to do it hard, you have to do it hard too mentality. Then I don't know where that comes from.
Mm.
Um, so yes, not only having them absence in that role, or for me, um, I thought it was interesting when I was at the University of Auckland, whenever I looked at, you know, female professors, of which there were very few in the STEM space, but the majority of them didn't have children. And so I go, oh, so is it that I can only get to that senior role if I choose not to have a family? I wasn't seeing a female role model in those senior spaces who also had 4 kids and was balancing it all. I saw very driven career women who had chosen not to have families for their career. And I think we have to be really careful that the role models that we're putting forward in those senior levels are fair and represent what our young women want for their lives as well. And so I think when you look at those, the cohort smaller.
Yeah. So can you tell us more about nanotech girls or nano girls tech? Um, I don't really know much about what your organization does, so it'll be great to have a bit of background.
Yeah, so look, Nanogirl Labs was set up as an educational company designed to increase and improve access to the STEM subjects. And we do this across the world. And I'm passionate about hands-on learning based on what you have and where you are and where you're from. And so we do programs all around the world, including New Zealand, where we help. I'll give you a few examples because what we do is very diverse, where we help people to build confidence around STEM subjects. So in New Zealand, we run teacher training programs, and we help you to upskill in your science and your tech knowledge. We provide really practical experiments that you can do. And one of our mottos, it's very different than other people's, is that we only do science experiments that use things that you would find either in your classroom or at the supermarket. I don't need a Bunsen burner. I don't need chemicals. I want it to be very practical. So, number one, you don't have to worry about health and safety. But number two, your students see that science is not only for those who have a lab coat and equipment, but science is something that you do every single day. So it's a big part of our mantra. So we run that. We run big live science shows where we do crazy, big, explosive experiments. And it's often the first time a child would have seen an equation that they might have learnt at school for an explosion literally blow up on the stage, and they can feel the heat, and it brings some of those subjects to life. Whereas in other countries, so we've been really privileged. We've just finished a project with MFAT where we have helped to restructure the science curriculum for 4 Pacific Island nations. And we've also written 100 different science lessons, and within that, recorded them all, videoed them all, provide all the lesson plans based on what I call Indigenous led learning. So, one of the challenges in our Pacific Islands is that science is often taught by somebody who's not a scientist. They're reading a textbook that's been donated from New Zealand or Australia, and
Mm.
it has examples in it that are just not relevant to children in the islands. And so, we totally rewrote those to have Indigenous led learning, to give examples of things that they would see outside their window, to use only equipment that they would have around them, to teach the same science curriculum, but in a way that they are learning that's relevant to them. And so a lot of what we do is how, I remember at school sitting there and thinking, I'm never going to use this. I never want a child in any of our programs to say that. I want a child to go, not only do I use this every day, but I see how science is in my life. I see how I'm actually a scientist already. And so we're building the confidence. And at Nanogirl Labs, we only have female scientists and engineers who work for us. So we provide positive role models who are actually incredibly diverse, culturally diverse, not gender diverse, they're all women, but they all have a qualification in a science or an engineering field, and therefore are positive role models that young people can talk to, ask about their research, and see visually, and hopefully break that stereotype of what a scientist or an engineer looks like in their mind versus what they're seeing out there. So yeah, we do lots of different projects around the world, but it's about building confidence and showing everybody that science and engineering are everywhere, and they're doing it all the time. They might not call it that. And if you've baked a cupcake, you were definitely doing science today, but you probably didn't thank yourself that you did some chemistry for that sweet treat that you're eating.
That's really interesting. And I really enjoyed how you said that you have women taking these courses as well, right? So obviously you have put a lot more thought to this process before you came to this decision and action. So how does gender bias affect the way women's contribution in science and technology are perceived and communicated?
Oh, there's so many ways. So let's think about um, communication. I think it's rare that I see a woman scientist put herself forward for communication. Like as a science communicator, I don't think we're often the ones putting our hand up and going, I want to be the public voice that speaks on that. So I don't think there's great representation when it comes to scientists communicating. And so I think we have to work really hard to amplify the voices of women in science and make sure that people realize that there are so many of us doing what we can do. And how do we create platforms where women can showcase their achievements and the recognition that they deserve? And so part of me hiring only female scientists and engineers is literally putting them on a pedestal publicly so you can see these amazing women who probably wouldn't have had a platform before. And as part of that, they're building their confidence in communication and to different audiences, and then they can go away and use that elsewhere in their career. I think also we have to, make sure that we're giving opportunities for women to speak at conferences. I hate what we call manels. You often see a panel made up of only, tech experts who are male, and so I'm a real advocate for making sure if you're having a panel, have you thought about diversity within your panel so that you're not just bringing in the easiest people you could find on a phone call, but you're actually making an effort to have good representation in your public spaces. But I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do around that. And part of that is building women's confidence to step up and speak out and put themselves forward. And number two, almost forcing the issue at the other end so that organizers of public events and conferences and panels are working harder to make sure that they're having good representation. Because if we don't do that, then all we see is the same people doing the same things, and that's what we assume is the norm.
In your advisory role, how do you approach the challenge of ensuring that gender bias does not hinder the commercialization and innovation process in tech startups?
Oh, so hard. Look, tech startups are hard, right? If you're in a tech startup,
Mm,
it is all in. You are working all out, like it's full on. So there's a lot of gender bias within tech startups for many reasons. One, we've seen that VCs naturally are more likely to fund a male tech founder than a female tech founder. For many of those gender bias reasons, we talked about the assumption that the female tech founder might not know as much as the guy, or not be pushy enough, or might not have pitched in a way that was aggressive enough, which, as we know, tech startups can be quite a sort of dog eat dog world. And also the hours that you would work in a tech startup are not that family friendly. So, you're looking at you'd have to hire people who were willing to work crazy hours during a tech startup. So I think inherently tech startups almost create a bias within themselves of the type of
mm.
people that they attract. But what I have seen is some really good initiatives in New Zealand where we've got, pitching that is just for female founders, especially female tech founders, to people like archangels and some female VCs, and working hard on knowing that there's a bias, or creating a bias in the system that might help the system to get a leg up so that we can build that. I think if we don't have many female tech founders who can get their teeth into something. And I always say the first thing you found is going to flop, right? And the second thing you found is probably going to flop. So what we need is a whole bunch of cool women tech entrepreneurs who fail at a whole bunch of stuff and then get really good at something. And it's building their confidence up too, to go, hey, you failed at that tech startup. That's great. You failed at another one. That's expected. You usually expect to fail at 7 startups in the US before you're going to create anything useful. How do we not let them take that failure to be, well, I shouldn't be in the tech startup space, but instead see it as a ladder up for sort of that badge of honor, that it means that they've learned resilience and they do something different next time. So I think we need to make sure that women have a seat at the table. I think we need to make sure that people understand that innovation happens because of diversity of thought and diversity of opinion. And if you don't have good diversity within your organization, you're not going to lead with your product for something that is going to solve a problem. And I saw this a lot when I worked for tech startups, big tech companies, and we see it all the time, where products just aren't invented for women. I look at simple things like the Lime scooter. You're scooting around on town on a Lime scooter, but it doesn't have a hook for your handbag at the front. And
Mm.
so inherently, as a woman, I have to try and figure out how I juggle my handbag, something that most of us will wear while trying to ride this scooter. It's just simple things. I look at how my cell phone is so large because it's designed for an average male size hand, not a female size hand. So I have to use it differently than I see my husband using it. There are lots of things that if you don't have diversity in the mix, women tend to just solve the problem because they have to use it differently because it wasn't designed for them. And you go, well, if you add diversity to the mix and you're designing tech that's inclusive, all you're going to do is have more people buy it. So
Mm.
surely it's a good thing. And the research is really clear. If you have diversity in your startup, your product tends to be way more successful because you've solved a lot of the problems that weren't your blind spots by not having diversity. But I do think the tech startup landscape needs a bit of a shake up because it is still, I call it a very bro landscape. It's still very male dominated and male young person dominated. And there's typically an arrogance around that. And so it goes back to imposter syndrome of how do we get women to fight and be more aggressive in those tech startup rooms, and pitch probably more confidently than they would have done before, um, to get that same sort of respect from the VCs and the investors. It's still not that welcoming a space.
So, when you founded your organization, what were the challenges that you faced? What were your failures and how did you mitigate them?
Oh, so many of them. I mean, so many. I think if you found anything, you come in all rosy-eyed of we're going to fix all the problems and it's going to be easy and we're going to make a lot of money and we're going to do all of this. And never happens like that. We've had a lot of challenges around changing in government. So again, since the government has changed, priorities have changed, and we're having a real challenge right now around this government choosing to focus on structured literacy and structured maths, which really has meant that science and digital technologies are not important to teachers right now. So there's been a huge drop off in schools wanting to learn science or digital technologies because the funding has gone. And so we're having to find funding from other revenues to still make sure that education happens, because we think it's important, but government priorities will change your landscape. I think also we got a bit of flack at the beginning because the company is called Nanogirl, and we had a lot of people go, "Oh, why is it not for men or boys?" And it is. We're inclusive for everybody. We just chose a name that was deliberately controversial. Um, and I go, it's so interesting because Nanogirl is a science superhero, and you never hear somebody go, "Oh, Superman!" Like, why? It's just, oh, Batman. Like nobody's come across those sorts of superhero names and gone, "Oh, well, my daughter couldn't like Superman." I'm like, it's so interesting. So having to take some of that flat, as well. Um, and yeah, some of the things that we've launched have been total flops. I launched I've worked so hard building a electronics kit so that kids could build their own Bluetooth speaker from scratch, and it was launched as a Kickstarter, and so much R&D to make sure that all of our ISO compliance and everything else. And it ended up being a product that didn't go to market because it ended up having a $50 price point. And what I learned is that parents went, "Oh, I can buy a Bluetooth speaker for $30 off the shelf. Why would I spend $50 on one that my child has to build?" Because they didn't want to pay for that learning component. But I really wanted something that was made in New Zealand, and that comes with an expense. And so, a lot of R&D was invested into that over several years for a product that didn't go anywhere. And I think it's because I value learning electronics and building something for a child, but a parent doesn't necessarily give it that same value. So yeah, there's been lots of successes, but also a few failures that I've cried a little bit about because, you don't start a project unless you think it's amazing. But then you just accept that the market is the market. And just because I love STEM doesn't mean that all parents do, and all parents want to put a price to that. So, but you keep going and you keep pivoting and you keep making new things based on how the market is changing. And that's how you survive, I think, as an entrepreneur.
Is there a support system within New Zealand where female entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs can get together and have conversations? Are there any meetups?
Look, I think there's lots of little meetups. So there's a great thing called She Sharp, which is all about for young people to get to see a female speaker in the tech space and sort of see that as a positive role model. I think for me, and again, our ecosystem has changed with our government. We used to have a lot of incubators, and a lot of those have gone. And with that, we've lost a lot of that sort of group mentality of bringing these types of women together. I think a lot of us, because New Zealand is small enough, just reach out to each other and
Mm.
catch up. So I have a group of female entrepreneurs that I catch up with every so often, and we just sort of complain about a few things and celebrate each other's successes. um, and I think you sort of have to create your own little group sometimes. And New Zealand is small enough to do that, and everybody is all pretty approachable, and you can find us all on social media now. So I think we do that on their own. I don't think that I know of a formal sort of female, especially female tech startup program that exists just for women. But I do think some of the programs like Tech Stars, which is a sort of a tech entrepreneurial learning program, are really good at recruiting for diversity and making sure that a diverse cohort of students apply to that. But yeah, I think we're still rolling our sleeves up and finding our own people and sort of creating our own groups.
What advice would you give to young women entering fields like nanotechnology or engineering, where gender bias is very pronounced?
I hate saying it because I almost feel like I don't want to put them off while they've even started. So I try and put a positive lens on it and then put my phone number on the bottom. I go, oh, but if you do come across anything, please give me a call. Because my hope is always that the next generation is going to go into an amazing workplace where they're not seeing this. And it's going to, so I don't want to be all negative on these young people just because of my experience and maybe the most recent experience I've seen. Every year I'm optimistic that this next cohort of girls that are going to go in are going to have the most amazing experience. And I don't want to sort of give them all the negativity up front. So my advice is always, number one, educate yourself about imposter syndrome. If you can learn about it and learn whether you have it, and if you do, how bad you have it, you're going to help yourself no matter what you go into. Number two, don't think that a career is for life. If you change your mind, it's okay. If you like something and then you like something else, it's okay. Number three, especially as a woman, know that if you want everything, it's going to be hard. So having a career and having a family, you might watch other women and think, wow, it's so easy for them. I think it's always going to be a juggle that you always feel that you're failing at. You're either not spending enough time at work or you're not spending enough time with your kids. And understand that I think every parent, especially every mother, working mother, feels that. And so don't think that some people have got it all sorted and it must be really easy for them. And so if family is what you want, prioritize it. Like just know that it's going to be a phase in your life where things are more juggled. And that's okay. It's just a phase and it will pass, and you'll never regret the time that you've spent with your kids. And so, and then I speak to a lot of women who have had their kids and then are not confident to go back to their workplace. And so take a much more junior role after their children. And so then I say, make sure that you hold your own and you go back in to the level that you left at. Don't do yourself a disservice just because you chose to take some time out for parenting. And I don't think we talk about this being a parent issue as much as we should, especially in the tech space where hours are awkward, and in engineering where you can't job share necessarily. Just know that, you've got to do what's right for you too, and then we'll work really hard to get you back into the workplace. But don't think it's always going to be rosy, but also know it's such a rewarding career. You get to solve global problems for the world. Like, who wouldn't want to do that? You get to create things that have never existed before. It is such a privileged position. And the more diverse you are from the norm in that field, the better you are at doing this because you're seeing the problems that people in the space haven't even thought about before. And so I say, do it. But also, here's my phone number. Give me a call if you get stuck, and we'll see what support systems we can put around you.
Yeah. So what do you envision for the future of gender equality in tech industry? And what role do you see yourself and Nanogirl Labs playing in achieving that vision?
I'm always going to be a voice, a public voice that makes sure that we're holding people accountable to poor behavior, to, making sure we've got pay equity, making sure that we are giving equal opportunities to our young people so that they can have these experiences. And for me, I see a real postcode lottery in New Zealand, and I'm trying to work against that, which is if you live in a city, you're much more likely as a child to have an experience in the STEM space than if you live in our regions. And so, how are we making sure that all of our children have equal opportunities around education and exposure to some of these things? I never predict the future because life always throws curveballs at you, but I always stand by my morals. My morals are how do we reduce the inequality around the digital divide? How do we make sure that in a world that is progressively increasing in its need for digital, that we're providing the learning, the education, the funding that is needed to make sure that everybody in New Zealand has access to technology and technology education, and that we're helping to break down some of these barriers by increasing, public visibility of what scientists and engineers look like, helping build that confidence, and calling out poor behavior. So I'm going to continue to do that. And I don't think it matters what government is in or what the landscape is doing. I think that's always going to be what I stand for.
Excellent. What actionable steps do you think tech companies can take to combat gender bias and create a more inclusive environment?
So many easy ones. The first one is making sure that the CVs that come into your job are anonymized. Step number one. It's really easy in HR. We've seen the evidence that you look at somebody's name or you look at somebody's perceived gender and you make an assumption before you've even read the thing. So anonymize some of that. That's an easy one. Making sure that you've got programs in place where you're working with universities or high schools to sort of integrate those students into so create a program, a filter program through, so they're starting to see what they do. I think we need to talk to policymakers to support some systemic changes that promote gender equality in the workplace. Closing the gender pay gap is an obvious one. Ensuring access to STEM education for all is another obvious one. I think organizations need to make sure that there is ongoing mentorship for their new employees to make sure that they are looked after and they feel welcome and they feel supported. So, I mean, so many. And having a diversity and inclusion department as a priority in your organization helps you to see the things that and uncover the things that you might not have noticed before and help you to reshape your organization to be more inclusive. And if you're more inclusive, you're retaining your staff, and everybody wants staff retention because you've got that institutionalized knowledge. You've also got that longevity of not having to retrain and rehire somebody. Now that's expensive. So everybody wants to keep people. And how do you make sure you're keeping the right people and you're keeping them well? I think having a diversity and inclusion priority in your organization is a really important one. Lots of little steps. I always say this, there's no one thing that's going to change the needle, but lots of people doing lots of little things really help to make a big movement happen. And so you might not feel like you're doing much, but if you're doing something and we're all doing something, then we're all shifting the needle, hopefully to a more inclusive space.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Mishra. It was really awesome to have this conversation with you. Any final thoughts from your side?
No, thank you for having me. I'm always positive. I'm always hoping that the next generation going in are going to have no issues. It's going to be all inclusive, and here we go. But I don't know. Until it is, we'll keep picking at this. And thank you for creating this podcast to raise some of the awareness about it.